Orcs Don't Babysit, Part 3 by Tony Edwell, aka Dragons After Dark. For the second morning in a row, Crawled's dreams were interrupted by a presence. However, when he opened his eyes this time, he was greeted by eggs as they sat on his chest. "I suppose you're hungry," he said. They chirped softly and nuzzled their nose along his cheek. "You're too cute for your own good," he grumbled, and cupped a hand under its bottom as he sat up. Eggs climbed up and settled across the back of his shoulders, and anchored themselves by curling their tail over the front of his shoulder and under his armpit. Once Eggs settled, Crawled walked barefoot over to the kitchen to make everyone breakfast. And on his way, he could already hear her tinkering in her workshop. Yesterday, they'd discovered that Eggs enjoyed a wide range of foods, so he set them on the table with a plate of strawberries while he fried up the fish he'd caught from their pond. Fixa had joined them on the dock and spent more time watching Eggs than fishing, utterly enamored by how deftly the baby darter snapped bugs from the air. Crawled cracked a small smile thinking about it while he carefully deboned one of the fish. Leaving it raw, he set it in front of Eggs, who immediately switched over to the meat. Turning back to his task, Crawled pulled out more strawberries and grabbed some of the tomatoes he'd sliced the day before. Once he finished frying the fish and tomatoes, he hit the red button against the wall over the sink. After a moment, the sounds from the workshop ceased, and half a minute later Fixa came into the kitchen, her face streaked with sweat and grime. "Smells good," she said, heading over to the sink and washing up. In the meantime, Crawled got the table set up, and though it was cramped with Eggs sitting on it, they made it work. After they'd been eating for a few minutes, he said, "It's still early enough, so I think I'll go hunting." "You did promise Droth," she said, but bit her lip. "Do you think that'll be okay with that ogre running around?" "I'll be heading to the other side of Mohawkie," and the ogre was heading out of Fairless toward Thousand Needles. "It'll be okay," he reassured her. "If you say so," she said, not sounding completely convinced. Then she looked down at Eggs with a smile. "Looks like it's just you and me, buddy." Eggs looked up at her and jumped over to Crawled, again hunkering down on his shoulder while wrapping their tail tightly under his armpit. Eggs let out the most defiant, yet quiet chirp. "I think they're trying to say they'll be super quiet," Fixa said. "I am not taking a one-day-old child with me on a hunt, and that's that." A half hour later, Crawled was dressed for hunting. He had his crossbow, quiver of bolts, pack, and Eggs. "I do not agree with this," Crawled mumbled as he headed to his planned hunting ground. As usual, he'd left Fixa at her shop. He had no idea what she was tinkering on now, but she'd said it was a surprise for the warriors of Mohawkie. Crawled was sure this did not bode well for them, and hoped the Earth Mother was strong enough to protect them from whatever she was concocting. Just before reaching Mohawkie, he left the trail and headed north around the camp. While this direction wasn't safe per se, since he still had to dodge corrupted dryads and a handful of gnolls, it was the direction he'd previously found bears and wolves to hunt. However, just as they were reaching where he planned to start his hunt, Eggs loosened their tail's grip and let out a croaking hiss before taking to the air. "Eggs," Crawled whispered in alarm and reached out for them. Despite the darter's wobbly flight path, Eggs remained just out of his reach and continued in the direction they'd launched themselves. It seemed like Eggs was heading that way purposefully, as though they knew where they were going. Maybe they know where their parents are, Crawled wondered as he followed. He scanned the area as they moved to make sure nothing was going to jump out and eat them. Thankfully, nothing more than the sound of the forest and the oppressive heat and humidity pressed in around them. Time crawled on as he watched everything possible all at once, especially the little darter bobbling through the air. Finally, Eggs descended to the ground near a tree and hunkered down behind it, quickly looking around the tree and back at Crawled. Their caution slowed his steps, and he dropped into a crouch as he moved forward, straining to hear every little thing he could. It wasn't until he made it to the tree that he could just pick up the rumble of low voices. He set his pack on the ground as quietly as he could, and took a knee behind the tree before slowly peeking around to see what Eggs had found. Grim totem. As he counted, he realized they were just shy in number of the Mohawkie warriors, but it wasn't always numbers that won a fight. As he continued to scout the area, his blood froze. Just past the center of their camp was a huge cage of sprite darters, ranging from babies' egg size to adults. Speaking of eggs, he turned to check on them. Instead, he caught a grim totem sneaking up. One of their horns was broken and jagged, their fur a ruddy brown, and eyes dark and beady. Krald had just enough time to raise his crossbow to block a blow from their cudgel. The crossbow was strong, but not strong enough for a downward strike from a tauren with a big, ugly stick. It splintered, and the cudgel continued downward and slammed with a dull thud against the top of Krald's left shoulder. Pain ripped through Krald's shoulder, followed on its heels by a rush of heat. When he couldn't move his arm to redirect the next blow, he realized the grim totem had dislocated it. Krald clumsily dodged the next attack by throwing himself to his left toward the ground. He landed directly on his dislocated side and let out a sharp growl as agony exploded through his arm. He hadn't brought his sword, but he grabbed for the large dagger at his belt. Before he could get it, the earth reached up and grabbed his arms like jagged fingers. Rocks and soil churned over his body and legs, pinning him to the ground. As it rolled, crawled over onto his back and crept up toward his face, a shaman stepped from around the tree he'd been spying from. This tauren was taller than average, and their coat looked like snow sprinkled over dark earth. As the dirt and rocks slowly took the form of an earth elemental, the shaman commanded, "Bring him, Firmus, and disarm him." When it pulled the dagger out of Krald's belt, it also forced his arms behind his back. Krald grit his teeth against the pain in his shoulder that blackened his vision around the edges. By the time he got his ragged breathing under control and he could see again, he realized the grim totem had taken him further into the camp and right to the cage with the sprite darters. The shaman stepped up next to Krald and leaned down to speak in his ear. "They haven't been fed in a while. Keep them company for us, will you?" The grim totem with the cudgel hit the cage near the door to scatter the sprite darters, and opened it just enough for the elemental to toss Krald through. Cudgel tauren quickly closed the cage door as a couple of sprite darters rushed it, making him take a step back. He snorted in annoyance and took a step forward, fist clenched. "Leave them," the shaman said. "We have other things to tend to, and if it survives long enough we'll question it." Krald assumed he was the it. Cudgel tauren gave a snorting laugh, and the two of them walked away, which left Krald with the sprite darters, who turned their attention to him. He froze as they snuffled and nosed around him. He didn't want to hurt them, but he didn't want to be eaten either. One of them fluttered forward and gently landed on his uninjured shoulder. The same one eggs preferred. They were larger than eggs, and when they settled, they took a deep inhale at the side of his neck, followed by a mournful chirp. Krald blew out a relieved breath and cautiously rubbed a finger along the nose bridge of the darter. Just like eggs, their eyes closed, and they gave him an odd, rumbling croak. The fact that eggs wasn't in here with him gave him some hope. They were young, but hopefully they got somewhere safe, like Mohawkie. His hand dropped, but the darter remained on his shoulder. He wasn't sure how he was going to get out of this, and it almost made him chuckle at the irony of wishing he had one of Fix's exploding robots. However, the thought of his friend quickly wiped away the amusement. He'd told her the general area where he was, but Fairless wasn't small, and it was just her. He'd just have to bide his time, watch for an opening to escape, and hope Eggs was okay.